Thank you for coming to this month's Virtual Journal Club. This is normally headed up by Jen. I do want to say, let me know if I come across choppy, and I'm going to dial in because I always have internet issues about this kind of time when the rain starts. So that's a bit of a proviso there, and you can tell me if that happens. Normally headed up by Jen, who's away at conference today. So I want to jump in for two reasons, really. I like helping out, but also today's talk is, should Alexa diagnose Alzheimer's? And I think the emphasis is on like should. And I'm heading up the ADRD project, Alzheimer's disease and related dementias project here. So I've got a particular interest in this in this kind of like idea. And this is all about like the legal and ethical issues with these at-home consumer devices. I'm not going to go like into this because our speaker today, David Simon from the Petrie-Flom Center at Harvard Law School, is going to tell you all about the paper that he put together. But what I will want to say is that you'll notice that David's from Harvard Law School. And one of the things I really, really like about like digital medicine, the journal club that we have, and like just digital medicine in the field, is that sometimes we'll be talking to people who develop algorithms. Sometimes we'll be talking to people who are deep in qualitative work with patients. And today we're branching into like ethics and law and people in the law environment. It's just like, it's such a big field. It takes all parts of our science to make it work, and we all have to work together to really understand what we're doing. It's moving so fast that I think sometimes we are trying to catch up as a science, no matter what branch you're from. And it's just not left. Digital medicine isn't just left to people behind computer screens. And as you'll see today, there's a very, very good reason for that. I do have to just do some housekeeping. We are being recorded, so if you're not happy with that, please leave. No, don't leave. But we are recording it because it will go live on the website later for future use. And then we're going to have maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes of a presentation from David. And then afterwards, you can ask questions. You can either raise your hand, I'll pull you into the live area, so you can ask it live. I say I, but actually that's probably going to be Ali behind the scenes because I can't really work Zoom. Or you can type your question into the chat box. You can type it in as we go along, and then I can raise it later on when we get to the Q&A session. So yeah, that's it from me really. We're getting up to the 5-minute past time, so I do want to get started, and we're going to just do a quick handover of screens, and then David, please feel free to give yourself a little bit of an introduction and share your screen and give us your presentation. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Great, thank you. Just give me a second to share my screen.
No worries, I'll let you know when it's loaded up.
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a technical issue. Just give me 1 second.
Oh, that's okay. It's always when you're on the spotlight too, isn't it?
That's right.
Things work perfectly well beforehand, and then otherwise, I can share and I can go for your slides on this side.
I can do it. I would just have to log out and log back on for some reason.
Okay, let me share my screen and we'll go through it on my side. And I'll try and make this as seamless as possible for you.
Yeah, unfortunately, your screen has those animations built in, so
I'll just try and scroll past
all right.
them.
Yep.
Great.
So I'm David Simon. I'm a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School and a research fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law, Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. And I work with a team of people here at the center on a grant that's examining in-home digital diagnostic technologies and the legal and ethical issues that arise as a result of those technologies. And my own research interests are in drugs and devices and intellectual property. So you can advance the slide. All right. So the first thing I just like to set forth is, what were we doing in this paper? We were trying to figure out What are the legal ethical implications of using in-home diagnostic products? So maybe consumer-facing products that were adapted to diagnose a disease or condition, perhaps making them a medical device, perhaps not. You can advance, please. And the way we wanted to do this, we thought one way we thought would be a good way of looking at these legal and ethical implications would be through a vignette. So that's the methods section. So after I talk about the methods that we use to investigate these questions, and I'll talk about our findings and then some of our suggestions. Next slide, please. All right, so we used this fictional vignette where we had a 77-year-old woman whose daughter was concerned she might be suffering from some kind of cognitive decline. And so used a new product, a fictional product that we invented called Here, which was an Amazon product that monitored people in their home using Alexa along with artificial intelligence and machine learning to detect speech patterns, and it could potentially diagnose cognitive decline, and it would spit out a speech report that someone could use, perhaps bring to their doctor. So the daughter enrolls the mother and notices that in the speech report it looks anomalous, so brings it to the physician, and then as a result of that encounter, signs her mother up for credit monitoring service, which is supposed to detect suspicious activity. And in the process of the vignette, we see the daughter engage a caregiver and then notice that there's bruises on her mother's arms, and then review the tape, the digital recording, to see if the caregiver might have committed some kind of abuse, and hears a loud noise and a bang, but not much else. Next slide, please. All right, so the findings are really the categories that we wanted to explore. So we looked at 5 different issues: consent, bycatching, legal consequences, privacy, and FDA regulation, which I'm going to talk about more in a minute. But more generally, we noticed that there were at least 3 benefits, at least through the vignette, that we could find. One is a notice or initiation function if you have a direct-to-consumer application that potentially can diagnose a disease or condition. So it might initiate some kind of encounter with a physician. In this case, the daughter noticed that the speech pattern was irregular, and so decided to schedule an appointment with a neurologist and bring that finding to the neurologist. There's also a potential confirmatory function in cases of cognitive decline. It's often difficult for physicians to confirm the changes in a short clinical encounter, especially if they haven't seen the patient before, so they have no baseline. And sometimes family members and caregivers' memories may be skewed or biased in some way, or they're reluctant to speak up because they don't want to offend their family member or loved one. And here the technology, the speech report, might provide some kind of confirmatory function saying, hey, look, there is a problem, or there is a potential problem, and here's some evidence for it. And then finally, a benefit of these technologies is that they may be autonomy enhancing. So a device that kind of tells you your limitations also opens up new possibilities if it can give you assistance. So an Amazon product might help you remember that, hey, you actually ordered this already. Are you sure you want to order it again? Or it seems like you're having trouble asking this question. Do you want me to call somebody for you? Right? It has those potential possibilities along with the other kind of autonomy enhancing possibilities like ordering products and other things. All right, so those are the 3 primary benefits: notice, initiation, confirmatory, and autonomy. And then we try to look at those benefits through the prisms of each of these 5 questions. So advance the slide, please. So the first is consent, right? What is consent? The law, at least in the United States, defines consent as the informed exercise of a choice that entails an opportunity to evaluate knowledgeably the options available and the risks attendant upon each. Basically, you got to know what you're making a decision about, and to know what you're making a decision about, you need good information about that. The question with direct-to-consumer products like the fictional Amazon Here is, what does consent look like? are people given meaningful consent? Well, often with consumer products, as many of us know, you get a big agreement that you click through. You just click a box and say accept. Nobody reads that agreement. And in one case, as we detail in the paper, somebody signed up for Wi-Fi, and that obligated them to do 1,000 hours of community service, including toilet cleaning and sewage, cleaning out sewage blockages. So you got to be careful with these with these terms of service agreements. These are binding agreements that you don't really have a say in. Now, what happens if if you introduce the element of cognitive decline? Well, maybe a person can consent if they aren't yet experiencing cognitive decline, but sometimes the cognitive decline will be occurring before consent is given, and sometimes multiple events of consent will be needed. And if the person is suffering from cognitive decline, it raises the question of whether they are able to consent to further terms of service. And broadly, this raises the question of whether the model of consent that we have is the right one to apply to these kinds of devices, in particular to situations involving cognitive decline, but more generally for products that might diagnose a disease or condition when the terms of service may change, or even the functions of the product may change. Okay, next slide, please. Are you able to advance the slide? Thank you.
Yes, I got the bycatching slide up on the side. Hopefully
Thank you very much. Yep. All right, so what is bycatching? Bycatching refers to fish or other sea creatures that are caught unintentionally by people who are trying to catch other types of fish. And how do we mean that phrase to apply in this context? We are thinking mostly of informational bycatching. So the Amazon here, this fictional product, may be designed to catch information about the person who might suffer from cognitive decline, but in the process, it will pick up other information. It will pick up the voice and sounds of perhaps the caregiver, or if there's a roommate, perhaps the roommate. And as we saw in the vignette, this can raise complicated questions. For example, there was kind of an incidental finding, the speech report, and the speech report led Janice, the daughter, to review the digital recording, and in the process, she heard a loud noise and a bang. And there, the question is, well, who gave consent? Did the daughter give consent? Did the mother give consent? Did the caregiver give consent? Right. So all of these questions arise as a result of bycatching, and there could be additional questions if the hypothetical mother lived with a roommate. Would the roommate have to consent? What happens if the information that's collected is of a sensitive nature, a sexual encounter, credit card information? What's happening with that information? What obligations does the manufacturer have to keep that information safe or let others know that their information is being used? Next slide, please. All right, all of this information collection raises questions about what are the legal consequences of information that's collected. So here are two examples. Suppose that in the example we gave, the device detected cognitive decline, and that information, for whatever reason, was used in a guardianship proceeding or used as evidence that the person was unfit to drive. Well, if the person is suffering these consequences and the information that's being used is directly pulled from some of these devices, it raises questions of reliability. Are the data sets that are used to train these types of devices not only representative, but also applicable to the class of individuals which the device is being used on? And if the device does have legal consequences, potentially negative legal consequences, and there's going to be a fight over the quality of the information that's used, the device, although it promises some autonomy enhancement, may actually undercut some of the autonomous function and may erode the trust of people who are using a device, which could lead them to alter the way they use the device, and perhaps the reliability of the device then changes. Okay, here's another example. There are some state there are state laws in the United States that require people to report elder abuse. And one question is, well, could any entity or person, like a daughter who receives the recording, or the manufacturer itself, in this case Amazon, have some kind of reporting requirements based on the information it processes? And if it does, what does that mean for how that information is being used? And if it doesn't, that also can affect how a company or firm might use the information. So lots of legal questions arise as a result of the information collection. Next slide, please. Now, we also took a look at two existing regulatory regimes that might help protect people in the use of these products. So one is privacy. Well, what is privacy? That's a difficult question. But in general, privacy in the legal sense of the term is a collection of state and federal laws that protect how information is collected, stored, used, and disclosed. And the main privacy law in the United States for health information is called HIPAA. And the issue with HIPAA as an existing regulatory tool that might be applied to some of these devices is that it probably already doesn't cover companies like Amazon. It's a law that's geared towards traditional healthcare entities like physicians and insurance companies. It's not geared towards companies like Amazon. And therefore, there's a kind of potential privacy gap. There are other privacy laws that can apply and limit how companies disclose and use information. But at least the main law concerning health information doesn't seem to apply. So there seems to be a somewhat of a regulatory gap here. Next slide, please. All right, there's another existing regulatory apparatus administered by the Food and Drug Administration, and it covers medical devices, what are just called devices.
That's advanced now.
I'm sorry? So medical devices are defined by federal law as
No problem. Just making sure it's advanced.
Yep, thank you. Are defined by federal law as those intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions. And the way that you figure out whether something is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions is by looking to what the manufacturer says about the device and what the device does. And you analyze the components of the device, each individual component of the device, to see whether the device as a whole is performing this diagnostic function. Devices are contrasted with what FDA has called low-risk general wellness products, which are intended only for general wellness use and are not intended to diagnose a disease or condition. And so one question that arises here is, what category does the fictional device fall into? If it falls into the fictional product, rather, if it falls into the device category, then there's FDA regulation of the product. But if it falls into the general wellness category, then there is no FDA, generally speaking. FDA exercises something called enforcement discretion, which means it's not going to require those products to be reviewed in any way by FDA. So one problem is that if it is a general wellness product, consumers might try to use it to diagnose themselves and then suffer some kind of harm as a result. But if it is not a general wellness product and is instead a device, then we know that at least it's safe and effective, or at least there's some reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for a particular purpose, say to diagnose cognitive decline, but it might not be approved, cleared, or authorized for all populations. So maybe in the example, let's say the product is has some kind of FDA review and is indicated for diagnosing cognitive decline in population 70 to 80. Well, if the daughter in this case decides that her mother could use the product, and her mother ends up in a different age category, say 60 or 50, and she doesn't know the difference, then you could get a false positive or false negative quite easily. And so there are tricky issues no matter which side of the regulatory line you fall on, with how consumers use device, how the product, how they understand the product to be used, and the limitations of each of those. Next slide, please. All right, so the takeaways that we drew from examining these issues is that the problems that these digital products give rise to are really multi-layered. They involve different ethical and legal regimes, and they're interconnected. All of them connect to each other. The privacy aspect connects to how reliable the information is, and how reliable the information is connects to how individuals use and rely on the product. And so each of these problems connects to the other in some way, and in some sense is layered on top of the other. So what ought we to do given these sets of problems? And these are just one subset of a larger group of problems that arise in this territory. So we thought that the solutions must be comprehensive, in the sense that we probably don't want a solution that's specific to the fictional device that we came up with, a fictional product we came up with. We want something a little bit more generalizable. We also need something to be flexible. We don't want a rigid approach that says, okay, these are the rules for this situation, but you can't adapt those rules to another situation. And that leads us to kind of a broadly applicable approach that is one that is generally applicable, but that can be tailored to individual circumstances depending on the facts of the case. And so we went through some proposals for how to do this. One would be to expand the existing frameworks like the device regulatory regime, like HIPAA, but it's not really clear this would help solve the problems identified, because technology is moving really fast and the current regulations may not be up for the task. FDA has tried to respond to some of the fast-moving technology. It just recently closed something called a pilot program it had been running called the pre-certification program for certain kinds of software as a medical device, digital technologies. But it's still a government agency. And so we think that it may not be fast enough to respond to all of these new problems as they arise. Something similar with the privacy frameworks and the consent frameworks. Our current privacy frameworks and our consent frameworks rely on affirmative consent at a point in time and de-identification of information. And it's not clear that that's going to be enough to protect consumers and safeguard information for the reasons that we stated in the paper, and I've briefly discussed here. Consent might need to be given at multiple points in time. Cognitive impairment might have kicked in. And in general, consumers often don't know what they're consenting to and may not have a choice. If you want to use the product, you have to consent. If you don't want to consent to specific terms or conditions, number one, you're probably not going to know what those are because you're not going to read it. And number two, the company's not going to allow you to withhold consent if you want to use the product. So you use the product, you consent, or you don't use the product. And that doesn't seem like potentially the right choice. So what did we come to view as a potential better solution? We thought in this space, it might be more fruitful to engage with the literature on ethics and privacy by design. And basically, the thrust of this literature says that you integrate the privacy and ethics concerns into the technical model itself. And so you rely on firms to design products that are privacy protective and ethics enhancing. What does that mean? Well, we just gave some examples in the paper about how this could work. These aren't the only examples, and they aren't meant to be the core sets of examples that should illustrate the point, but they at least illustrate what privacy by design and ethics by design might look like. So we said, in the case of the fictional Amazon here, we might have reminders that the product is recording you and that it's recording you for purpose X. The product might ask you to decide whether you want to continue using the product. Do you want to turn off monitoring now? It might even be programmed to notice key phrases that could indicate a conversation might be private or of a sensitive nature and say, I heard you say X. Would you like me to stop listening for now? And finally, it could also offer reminders for how the data could be used. Remember that I'm collecting this information for X, Y, and Z. If you don't want me to do this anymore, please tell me now. Right? So those are some examples. And then in the case of a product expressly diagnosing a condition or product that has limitations that's not appropriate to directly diagnose or a condition or disease, it might explain its functionalities, its limitations directly to the user. It sounds like you're asking me to make a diagnosis. I'm not able to make a diagnosis. The most I can do is X, Y, and Z. Or if I am making a diagnosis, remember that this diagnosis is based on a data set that for individuals only age 60 to 70 or 70 to 80. It's not meant to be a diagnostic tool for people under 60. Right? Those are the kinds of things that could be built into the program that either replicate the kind of physician encounter one might otherwise experience or in some way build in the privacy and ethical concerns. And so we think that this kind of proposal is the most flexible, but it's also broadly applicable and can be tailored to specific situations because the devices themselves are programmed in particular ways and they can be programmed for particular uses and to have these checks built in to safeguard consumer privacy and protect consumers from unethical practices. So that's it. Thank you very much. You could advance to the next slide, but it just says end or thanks.
Okay. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Because I've dialed in on my phone, given the lag. Perfect. Good. Thank you so much for that overview. Yeah, it's stayed true to paper, and you were able to really expand on some of the points there. I'm going to invite people to start putting their hands up, asking questions, but I'm going to kick us off because I think there's things that you touched on that I find really interesting, and I'm quite sure there are things you thought about as well. And it's this idea of data ownership, and this is kind of like a double-edged question. Is when this data is collected or would be collected in the future, who owns it and who should own it? Because I see a situation where there's lots of talk about blockchain your own data, sell it to who you want to sell it to, and the lady in this story, this fictional story, could own her own data and then choose who gets access to it, her GP maybe. But then if she doesn't own it, I think, and this is something you touched on as well, it's who does that data go to? Is there just a whole risk that these early markers, yeah, they could help us with early treatment, but they could also just get sold to our insurance companies who up our premiums, what are your thoughts on those two aspects, owning our own data versus the risk of it falling into being used for the opposite purpose which is intended to some extent?
Yeah, on the data ownership part, right now, large firms are collecting information about you and selling it to other people. De facto, that is, in fact, they basically are asserting ownership of that data set. The idea that data ownership better rules about data ownership will resolve some of these questions, I don't think is correct. Instead, what seems to be a better approach is to regulate how information is used. Now, this paper wasn't necessarily about how third parties are using information, selling it to other people. We didn't discuss that issue. It's certainly an issue. And elsewhere, I've argued with other people that it makes sense to have a regulatory regime that says, this is what you can and can't do with third-party data. with data from people that use your service. If you do this particular thing, then there'll be some penalty for doing it. So managing how data is used, I think, is a better approach than trying to resolve the issue through data ownership, because data ownership really creates more of a morass. And one negative aspect of potentially telling people, hey, you own the information you're giving up, is that it could create real problems for fruitful research. If everybody has a veto right over how their individual information is used, for any purpose whatsoever, then some of the research that these large firms are doing may not be possible. So while it's important to give people the right to opt out of certain kinds of uses of their data, I think it might be dangerous to give them ownership of the data. And there are actually firms that operate on business models that allow people to specifically opt in or opt out to research studies. I mean, they're more nonprofit at the moment, but you could imagine something similar happening in the for-profit space.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I guess, like, getting caught up in that idea of it's always nice for people to own their own data. You do forget about the downsides, which you highlighted there. Like, could just increase the bias, right? Because you'll have a limited subset of people who want to share their data. I was thinking about the consent issue as well, and I think, like, typically in consent, it's meant to be, whether it is or not, it's meant to be this ongoing process, right? Where and think about it in the case of this vignette. Each time the lady, I can't remember the name now, Jimmy, goes to see the physician, there's that idea that, you know, that's kind of the process of consent that happens each time they go see the clinician. Or even through a clinical trial study, people consent at the beginning, but there's meant to be this idea of ongoing consent to make sure people are happy to continue. But what does it look like here? Like, I guess, like you said, you've got the menu that people never read. But is it like, does purchase count as consent in this case? Does installing the software count as it? Does keeping it turned on count as consent? And I think one of the nice things that you mentioned as a remedy is like flagging, hey, look, I'm recording now, to make sure it's flashing so that you can make the choice of whether it continues like recording in the background or something. So yeah, that, if you want to talk a little more about that idea of like outside of the regulated space, like what are people just assuming is consent? Is it that button, or is it legally, is there other things like purchasing rep consent, installing rep consent? What if someone else installed it for you?
Yeah, exactly. There's a bunch of different issues here. So normally when we think of consent in the medical context, we think of informed consent to undergo a procedure, to see a doctor, to do any number of things. And so if you're undergoing a procedure or taking a medication, you know, presumably the doctor is going to explain that to you, and that's how you consent to the treatment. But in the case of direct-to-consumer products, we don't have that same relationship. And instead we have a contract, and the contract says, I'm going to sell you this product, and in return for selling you this product, you're going to give me money and also all of your information, and I'm going to use it however I want or however the contract says. And so there's a totally different dynamic happening between what is essentially a customer of a product versus a patient in the healthcare system. And the question we were trying to figure out is, you know, how do you think about that difference in a meaningful way? And so one of the solutions was, if you have a consumer product that tells you, hey, this is what you're consenting to, this is what we're going to be doing with your information, or we're recording you now, at least that's something better than what we have now, which is nothing, which is you sign up and your information goes to whatever company the product is, whatever company is making the product, and then sold to a third party. It doesn't rule out, you know, some of the other things that we were just talking about, like regulation of how third parties use information and better privacy policy and regulating information in a more comprehensive way. But at least this is a step towards building a better kind of consent model. I should also say that if the product is used, this fictional product, we kind of kept it ambiguous about whether it could actually diagnose anything. But if it could diagnose a disease or condition, we would hope that there could be some kind of intermediary, like a physician might say, hey, we're going to use this product to diagnose your Alzheimer's, and maybe the physician then is in a position to explain the limitations of the device in a way that the consumer might better understand. Now, the downside of doing that is it raises costs, right? If you have to have a physician prescription and a physician encounter, maybe more than one, that could raise the cost of the product. And it also folds in some complications about insurance reimbursement and other things. But at least there are other ways to build in some kind of consent process. So you have somebody who knows something about the device explaining the limitations of it to you, rather than just the click-through agreement that nobody reads.
Yeah, and just like you sort of pop up in the chat there when we're just highlighting kind of a point you made earlier, is yes, most people just don't read it. And there was that study that you had in the paper that you highlighted earlier where 22,000 people signed up to Wi-Fi and they just chucked a clause in there saying, yeah, you're going to do 1,000 hours of community service. They were never going to act on it, just to show that no one reads it, right? And having this like ongoing process of consent, I don't think it's perfect, like things you're explaining, but I think they're a lot better than what we have now.
Right. I mean, people definitely.
I definitely thought of that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to go on to the next point I was going to raise. In the meantime, is this idea of bycatching. I'd always thought it existed, but I never really had a term for it. Like, firstly, is that a term you came up with from the fishing industry, or is that a general term that's used in the field?
It's becoming more common in the literature. So we aren't the first to use the term.
Okay, I think it's a really cool term, and I think that to some extent, I'm going to go to questions in the audience in a bit, but to some extent, I think that with this idea of like bycatching, it's in terms of like, okay, you could be taking data from the wrong person and adding that into your model. Like you're trying to take data from Janine, but her friend's data is taken instead, right? Like to some extent, I think it's incumbent on people developing the devices to make sure that that is distinguished, they're good enough to distinguish between them. And I think the accountability comes from there. And I'm not sure if there are people in the audience who are these device developers who have strong views on that. Be like, no, actually we can't control everything, or we go to great lengths to make sure it doesn't happen. That'd be really interesting to hear. So I'm not asking you to speak up now, but just put it in the chat box if that is something you're doing in the day to day. There is a text chat in the comment. But I'm going to go to Battle actually. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hi, I first wanted to say thank you so much for your talk. It is completely in line with what I'm working on right now. On a super micro scale, we're doing the repeatability and efficacy of a voice-based stress analysis test that's on like an insurance website. And I think there's like a lot of ethical issues with just like linguistic analyzing devices. But in what you're doing, what are the future steps? And do you see like in the next 5 years or something like that, there being an association kind of like the FDA only dedicated to biotechnology?
Good question. I don't think, well, I shouldn't say that. I'm not optimistic that there will be a new agency that's dedicated solely to this particular problem, this problem of digital technology. I think right now, the two primary federal agencies that are dealing with some of these issues are FDA and the Federal Trade Commission, FTC. And there are a lot of different people from both directions pushing on those agencies to do more, but they're in some sense constrained by their congressional mandate. So unless Congress gives them greater power, I think those are the two agencies that are likely to exert the most pressure. And then the Department of Justice might also become involved when some firms start to merge, when there's two large firms that are starting to merge, and that can create competition problems. But so as far as I can tell, those are the two big federal agencies that are going to be monitoring the space. And FDA has really paid a lot of attention to digital technologies. So I think that's where a lot of the activity will be.
And then in regards to your guys' solution in this paper, what are the future steps now?
Yeah, I think the next steps are trying to develop some of these ethics by design principles and get them to be adopted by firms that are designing these products. So, I mean, a lot of large companies are concerned with some of these issues. You know, Microsoft has an ethics board. They're concerned with these issues, and so getting a group of people together, both from industry and from kind of the ethics community, I think would be the way to push things forward. And also involving there's standard setting organizations that play a big role in what kind of standards are adopted technically. And so working with them to try and build some of these principles into the technical standards themselves might be something that I think would push the project forward.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
I'm gonna kind of go to one of the questions that we had in the chat, but also like add my own spin on top of it, because I think it links to the previous question the Backer gave us. Is the way I see this going forward is we just need frameworks, right? Frameworks that people in tech can follow and be happy to follow. I hear this a lot from our tech colleagues: is give us a framework, give us a checklist, and like we'll do it. Especially if there's something at the end of it, like some kind of certification to say, I've done this, I have followed some rules that make you safer, or something like that. I think that, like, to the point you just made, like, who's responsible for that framework? Is it people like DiMe, or is it more people like the FDA coming up with these frameworks? And I don't think there's an answer to that. But then this brings to Caitlin's question: are the ethical concerns the same or different with an approved device from the FDA to diagnose Alzheimer's disease? Required prescription. Rather than it being a consumer device, it's now a medical grade device that's gone through the qualification process, it's got its regulation, and you need to get a prescription. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so first thing is, if it's an approved device, meaning it's undergone pre-market approval, then most likely there's some kind of clinical trials that have been done. And the manufacturer can discharge, basically, it has a duty to warn consumers about risks associated with the device and provide information. So there's going to be labeling that accompanies the device. It's going to be a different kind of device. And the physician is going to be responsible for telling the patient how this device is used. So I think it does change both the legal and ethical considerations, because now we have what's called a learned intermediary in legal speak. We have a physician who's supposed to know something about the technology, communicating what it does to the patient. Now there's a new set of ethical concerns, which is, what is the physician expected to know, and what do they know? And sometimes they might not know as much as they ought to. And so there, we might think about liability for physicians as a potential tool to increase their understanding. We might also think about non-legal approaches, how to better educate physicians and make sure that they understand them. Some of that can also be by ethics by design, to explain to physicians in kind of plain language what the product is meant to do and how it's meant to do it, something beyond the labeling insofar as the FDA would allow it. And then maybe physicians, there are societies like this one and other physician societies that might work together to educate physicians about the limitations. So I think some of the ethical concerns are changed, but a new set of ethical concerns arise as a result.
Yeah, and I think that I think kind of paper, it's not, it was a thought that I had when reading. It's this idea of like, if you get things subscription, that's like a whole nother level, which is great. But then you've got people using it for off prescription use and maybe still talking to their doctor about it, and then you get this whole other issue.
Yeah, and if I can just follow up on Wen had a comment, which is that physicians are uncomfortable engaging with technology products because they're worried about additional liability. And there are ways to address this problem. It's a complicated topic, but generally it really depends on the type of device. Like, is it a clinical decision support software, or is it an autonomous diagnostic tool? And how is it approved by FDA? Like, all of these things affect whether physicians are likely to use the product. So all I can say is that it's a complicated issue that I'm working on now, but I understand that physicians are uncomfortable with adopting new technologies, and I think there are some ways to get them to adopt the technology, even though it may look like there's an increased liability risk. So I just wanted to address that point. And then I saw that Jenny had a question too. You're on mute, Pip.
Things that we've done. Oh dear. Okay.
Well, now
maybe maybe I'm just running a bit slow, but please, Jen, did you want to jump in with your question there? No, it's okay. It's just some point. Send me a direct message there about the UK stuff. So yeah, points were that there was lots that would argue about open consent initiatives that democratize ownership data is what we were talking about earlier. But I think the point related more to what we're talking about here is different barriers on adoption. Like in the UK here, we've got NICE, and it's a very different perspective. So I'd like to say in the paper, you also focus very much on the US. Coming up with frameworks for the US is important, and others will follow suit. But it will be different no matter where you go, and it makes a whole hard sort of like landmine of decisions that have to be made from the tech developers' perspective to be able to pursue this, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of evidence generation by other regulators in other countries is interesting and not absent from conversations here. So just because you get a device approved doesn't mean that you'll get it reimbursed by the federal government or private insurers. And so the vignette was again kind of ambiguous about how much data there was, and it didn't say anything about how much data there was and who was paying for it. We assumed that the consumer was paying for it. But as soon as you get an approved device, of course, you can have a cash pay model, but most devices operate under, most successful devices that are through the medical system accepting dental products here in the States are successful because they get reimbursement. And so there is a question of what kind of evidence is going to be required by NICE. Is it going to be different or similar to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services here in the United States? And how are companies going to manage that? Are they going to just go to the United States first and only because the evidence required for reimbursement is less than by NICE? Because here we generally don't assess comparative effectiveness like with drugs, but that's something NICE does. So I think those are all really difficult issues that need attention. We just didn't have the space to attend to them here, but they certainly affect adoption and use.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we're going to start wrapping it up now, but thanks so much for going through this. I think we don't have enough of this in the field, and maybe it's bigger from like the law side where you come from, where you you take a vignette, you make it specific enough but vague enough to be a thought exercise, and you talk them through what you already know in science or what you know from legal history and ways forward. And I think having this kind of thought exercise is starting point for understanding where we need to go while filling some of the gaps in the middle. So I just want to give you 1 minute if you've got any like final thoughts you want to close up on before I share the screen again and start wrapping up.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that this is really a snapshot of a broader set of legal and ethical issues that we didn't have a chance to delve into. And so we're aware of those and we're interested in talking to other people about them. And we hope to continue to explore these in the future. So this was hopefully giving you a nice taste to whet your appetite of what's to come. But thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. I think it really did whet our appetite completely. My screen again now, if you can all see the slides, and just making you aware, tomorrow we now have the V3 in action. Like a lot of you will probably remember this V3 paper. It's one of the cornerstones of frameworks. We talked about frameworks earlier and how they're unique frameworks. Well, V3 is one, but from the technical side, is this idea that devices need verification, analytic validation, clinical validation, and a lot of the time we have this and we say, oh yeah, it's needed, but we don't have like examples of how is this actually being done at the minute. So those of you out there who want to join tomorrow, please look us up on the website and join the V3 in action talk tomorrow. And then also coming up next month, we've got a patient matters endpoint. This is a comment piece that I wrote about like designing endpoints in clinical trials and how you could have like black box algorithm that is really accurate, but you're not able to maybe completely interpret it, or patient can't interpret it, versus something that is more patient relevant. How do we go? Which direction do we go when creating clinical trial endpoints to try and keep the patient in the loop? How do we get there, and how do we start moving beyond that? And naturally, with my colleagues, I worked on that with Diana Raphael from Regeneron, and Jen's going to be back moderating us for that one. And that's December 7th. But all that to say, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, David, for presenting on that work and all the questions that have come up. I think there's been even more coming through in the chat that hopefully you've had a look at, and either comments or questions. But if anyone does have any further questions or wants to talk more about this and I think Wednesday, you want to be kept in the conversation, etc., then yeah, like reach out. We can link you with David or get on LinkedIn, and let's keep this conversation going. But like you said, it's really a start to sort of start us thinking on this and thinking how people like us who deal with it can start pushing things forward. Thank you again very, very much.